Hi, everybody, and welcome to M Bits with M Seminars. And I'm Robin Jones, and some of you know me, and you're going to get really tired of me. Hopefully not. So today I'm going to talk about the difference between a rejection and a refusal. So often I hear, oh, my application was rejected for this, it was rejected for this, or it was refused for this, and that kind of thing. Just to tell you right up front, there is a difference. A refusal is something that is different from a rejection, and the implications can be considerable. Okay, so we're talking specifically about temporary resident applications. A rejection generally means that the IRCC doesn't consider there to be an application. There's no application. And usually the reasons for that is no fees, insufficient fees, and or no signature. So usually anything else missing would result in a refusal. In other words, you did not submit what was required in order to make any kind of a decision. A reject means that the things required to even look at the application aren't there. So it's not considered to be an application. Now, this doesn't really have much of an implication when we're talking about sending a temporary resident application to a visa office. It really doesn't, because they're going to say, oh, you didn't submit the fees, goodbye. And it's almost impossible to not do things correctly, to have the fees and the signature. It's almost impossible to do that online because the application won't be accepted unless correct fees are there. And it won't be accepted. This is for out-of-country applications. This is to visa offices. I'm not talking yet about inland applications, just so that you know, because there's a difference. Online application isn't separate from inside Canada or outside Canada, just so that you know. That's another confusion that people have is, oh, I didn't submit to the visa office, I submitted online. Well, you submitted to the visa office, you just did it online. So just so that you know, wherever it's going, that's still where it's going, although IRCC can change that at their whim. Just so that you know. So basically, if you're submitting to a visa office, it's not really a problem unless the person is also in Canada and they also have to maintain their status, which is a separate process when you're applying for something temporary outside of Canada. But generally, if they're outside of the country, so say they're in India and they're applying for a study permit, they didn't submit enough money because they submitted it through the VAC and they weren't paying attention, it's going to get rejected. And there's, it's not an application. Status isn't an implication. Just time is going to be an implication because it's going to delay the processing time because they don't have an application that's being looked at. So that's what a rejection is. A rejection means that IRCC does not consider it to be an application. So again, in a temporary resident document, we are talking about fees, no fees, incorrect fees, or no signature or missing signature somewhere along the line. Okay, and that's what a reject is. A refusal is quite a bit different. Okay, refusal is you're missing a copy of your passport. A refusal is that you didn't adequately explain how you met the requirements. So in a case of a temporary resident visa, you didn't explain how how you have significant ties to Sri Lanka, or you don't have sufficient funds, that kind of thing. So you haven't met the test of submitting the required documents in order to be eligible for the document you're asking for, and that's a refusal. So that means that they've looked at the application, they've made a decision, there is no refund, and that kind of thing. So again, as far as major implications for the client, it really usually doesn't make a lot of difference if they're outside of the country making the application. It can make it a little bit more difficult depending on how many refusals they have in the same type of an application. But typically it's not going to have necessarily long-lasting implications unless the reason for refusal is admissibility issues. When we're talking about temporary resident documents applied for from within Canada, it's a little bit different because they can have significant impact depending on what happens. And that's where it's really important to know the difference between a refusal and a rejection. A rejection, again, in this case means that there's no application. So there's something missing that makes it an application. And for the purposes of a temporary resident application, really we're talking about the signature, lack of fees, or insufficient fees. So if you don't submit enough money, or you don't sign the application form, or your client doesn't sign the application form, it's not an application. Usually when you're applying in Canada, we're talking about potential status issues. So there is a potential that the client can lose their status and not be restorable, simply because if there is no application, there is no decision being made, and therefore the expiry of status reverts back to the expiry of the original or the last document or period of entry. So let's look at an example for that. So if a client is here, they came in as a visitor to Canada, they had a temporary resident visa, and they came to the port of entry and they were allowed in. They came in on January 1st of 2018. So that means that they had until June 30th, 2018 to remain in Canada as a visitor. So they may or may not have gotten a stamp, but their passport was scanned in. They weren't reduced in time, so we can assume that they were given 6 months. So at that point, they have valid status until June 30th. So say, for example, they apply for an extension of that visitor status and they ask for another 6 months, and they do that on June 29th. Okay, so because they've submitted the application before the expiry of the original status, they have what's called implied status. So say like 2 or 3 months down the road, for argument's sake, let's say September 30th, the application is looked at. Really, they're looking right now at it's been a little bit longer, expected to get longer. But so say 3 months down the road, they look at the application and they're going, oops, they didn't submit fees. This is not an application. So they reject the application. The letter will say your application has been rejected because you didn't submit the applicable fees. But this is not a refusal. This is not an application. This is not a submitted application. So what happens is that we're looking at 3 months down the road, which is more than 90 days. We're looking at the fact that this application is now rejected. Status expired on June 30th. Okay, it's not on the day that it was rejected. That's only if it's refused. So on a reject, it goes back to the original expiry from that application, which means now this person is not only out of status, they are also no longer restorable because of the timing of that application. So that has an implication. So you want to make sure that even if you think that your client's not going to be approved, you make sure that you have the fees and that you have the signatures in place. And again, it's very difficult to not have those things in place on an online application, because on the online application through our AR portals, we're signing on behalf of the client electronically. So the signature's there. And the fees, it won't allow you to submit the application without the fees. So unless you calculate things wrong and don't submit the right application, and that happens too. So you need to be careful that you are applying for the correct documents. So unless that happens, it's almost impossible to make that error when you're submitting an online application. So it's mostly going to be the paper applications that you could have issues with. But if that happens, then you've got a client who's no longer out of status, not restorable, and has to leave the country in order to correct the status. Okay? It's different from a refusal. So take the same scenario. The person came in January 1st. They have valid status until June 30th. On June 29th, they submit an application. They have implied status until a decision is made on the application. But they forgot to submit a copy of their passport. Okay, so fees are there, signature is there, everything is there except for one crucial piece of documentation that's required in order to make a positive decision. So a decision can be made, but it's going to be a negative decision because It is an application. It's just missing a component. It's missing a document required. So in that case, if you've got a really nice officer, they'll call and ask for it, but they may not call and ask for it if they don't get it in time, or if you don't get the message, or whatever reason. They will refuse the application. But this is the different impact, is that if they refuse the application, then implied status ends on the day they make the decision. So if on September 30th, they make the decision that, nope, you didn't submit your passport, this is now a refused application, then the person had status until September 30th. So they're going to get notification within a couple of days online. And then they're going to go, oops, I forgot to do that. So then you can submit a new application with restoration fees, because we've got 30 days from that refusal decision in order to submit the request for restoration. So you hope that in a case like that where something's missing, you hope it's not something that would result in a reject, because that can have status implications if your client is in Canada, right? You're hoping at that point for refusal. So even though you have to pay the restoration fees, they can usually be restored. You just have to go through the process again and make sure you're submitting everything correctly. And again, it's a lot more difficult to submit an incomplete application online. It is still possible to submit an application with missing information. It's still possible to do that, to submit the application with missing information online, but it's a lot more difficult to do. So as much as there are certain visa offices that I prefer not to deal with, even more so, I prefer not to deal with the VACs when it comes to overseas applications. I don't so much have a problem dealing with CPC Edmonton, formerly CPC Vegreville, but we're also looking at now extremely long wait times, and that may not be in the best interest of our client, although it may. So you have to weigh that out, whether or not it's better. But make sure that you are at least getting the fees correct and getting the signature on when you're submitting a paper application. It's slightly different for PR applications. Some PR applications are subject to what we call R10, and essentially that means that there are certain documents and certain items that need to be submitted in order for the application to be accepted, to gain acknowledgement of receipt. So it's a little bit more complicated. It used to be the same as temporary documents, where it was all fees and application. And as long as those two things were there, it was brought in as an application and missing information was requested. Now they did make a change, and as per regulation R10, the applications now have to be complete, which means that everything on, say, for example, for a spousal application, everything that's on the document checklist has to be there, or it will be rejected. And it will not be processed. It will not even be entered into the system. So you need to have all the forms. So the forms, including the signatures, you need to have the payment, the minimum payment, which is the application fees and the sponsorship fees in the case of a sponsorship. You don't have to have right a permanent resident fee. That's not required until the very end, although that can be included. Sometimes you'll be required to put in police clearance certificates, and sometimes you won't. Depends on the month, because that's been changing. It's changed a few times in the last couple of years. But be careful to read your document checklist and don't ignore anything, because chances are really good that your application will be rejected if you don't have it there. It's even happened that even if items are there, they get rejected. That's an error, and unfortunately, there's not a lot you can do about it, because they will have no record of the application in the system that's been for an application that's been rejected. They won't have that. So that's one of the things you want to make sure of, is when you're talking about a permanent resident application, that you're carefully going over the document checklist and making sure everything is there. Everything. And make sure that you're making it very clear in your submission letter and on the document checklist where it is. So in some occasions, maybe a client isn't going to have a notice of assessment, or a sponsor isn't going to have a notice of assessment. You want to get a null notice of assessment if you need to. So say, for example, it's a Canadian citizen who's been living and working outside of the country. you can apply to Canada Revenue Agency for a null assessment. So basically it says, I've earned no money in Canada, I've not made any claim to taxes, and this is my tax return for this year, right? So you can do that. And so in order to make it a lot easier on your clients, it might be worth having them do that. So you just contact CRA for something like that. Having said that, I've had clients who have submitted the documents required and had them rejected for documents that were sitting on top of the returned file. And again, you can't do a whole lot about that because those applications are not accepted. All you can do is resubmit it with a whole lot of flags and sticky notes and that kind of thing, basically saying, see, it was here and you rejected it for this. Please do not reject it for this. If you're missing anything or if you've got a problem with what we're submitting, please let me know because we're submitting it. You're telling me we didn't. But that's pretty much all you can do. It will cause months of delay, but you can potentially, after 12 months from the original submission, ask for an update with the explanation that this is what happened. And they may look at it. I've had that actually happen. So you might get them to look at it a little bit sooner in view of the second submission if you've got the evidence that you'd submitted it previously and it was returned in error. So that's something to consider and that kind of thing. But basically what we're looking at when we're talking about permanent resident applications is it might not just be the signature and the fees that you're looking at as reasons for reject. It can be a number of other documents. So make sure you're going through those requirements and making sure that everything that they request that you provide, because if you don't, it's a rejection. And again, if a client is outside of the country, other than time, it's probably not going to affect them so much because they don't take the fees in that case. So again, you get the fees back if you paid the fees and it's something else that's missing. But you could be looking at time frames that maybe don't work quite so well. So that's something to consider as well. In Canada applications, again, a lot more serious because it will have status implications. So if we take our example of a spouse or common law partner application that has a request for an upfront work permit, we might want to consider as well, just in case it gets rejected, and even just in case it gets rejected in error, making sure that the person's visitor status is maintained. Separately from that is something to consider, something to talk to your clients about and let them decide. I know some RCICs don't agree with that, but the reality is if you send in their application very close to the expiry of their document, yes, they have implied status, but if it gets rejected, even in error, there's nothing entered into the system. So, and they reject the work permit as well, which means that there's no evidence that if you're missing something in your PR application, they reject the whole thing. So that means that the work permit doesn't get looked at. It's no longer implied status. It's looked at as the previous expiry date. So you want to make sure that that status is maintained. Otherwise, that has implications later on down the road and implying because that person will not be eligible to apply for the upfront work permit anymore. So it might be worth putting in a little extra effort and spending the extra $100 on the extension to visitor record application, the extension to visitor status, which is a visitor record application, if they need it. If they're going to have enough status to last through that period of time, even upon the rejection of the application, you can also do it at that time. But if you're kind of at the last end of the status, it's probably a good idea to separate that out just in case, because again, if it gets rejected, even in error, that can have status implications for the client in Canada. So you want to make sure that that's covered. Okay. So remember that our terminology is really critical. And those of you who do know me know that terminology is the one thing that I'm always going to correct you on, because if you are incorrect with your terminology, you're not necessarily thinking in the correct pathway, which means that you could accidentally, even if 99% of the time you use the correct terminology, that one time you don't, you might inadvertently grab the wrong application and then submit that wrong application, which can have adverse effects on your clients. So with reject and refusal, knowing the difference is critical, more specifically when the clients are in Canada, but it's always good to know the difference. and know what the implications are on each one, because they are different implications. So that's what I have for you today. If you have any suggestions for MBITS, either with MBITS, you can join my group, which is MBITS with Robin, so spelt exactly like that, IMM-BITS with Robin, and that's over Facebook. It's a private group. Remember, if you're trying to join the group, you will be required to answer the questions. You need to show how you're eligible to join. So either your RCIC licensing number, or if you're a lawyer, you need your numbers through your law society or bar association. I'm not sure which number you use. You'll need to basically show so that I can look you up and make sure that you're eligible. If you're a RISIA, I need your number there. If you're another authorized consultant, then I need to know your licensing number. If you're a student, I need to know the number of your your student ID number, what school you're attending, and when you expect to complete your education. If you're somewhere in between, when you expect to write your full skills exam and or be licensed. Okay, so those are what make you eligible to join the group. You must be an RCIC or other authorized representative, or a student, or somewhere in between there in order to join. MBITS with M Seminars is a little bit different. So that's this one here. So you go to the M Seminars website, mseminars.com. You're going to join the mailing list, and you're probably already there if you're seeing this. But if you you'll find out about the recorded version, which is this one, that way. But for those of you who have questions or think burning immigration topics that are too small for CPD programs, even if they're not, give us some more ideas for CPDs for heaven's sakes. You know, that'd be great to have something different. But burning immigration topics, large or small, send them either to info@atpeducation.ca, info@atpeducation.ca. That's my email address for MBITS. Or you can send it to MBITS, that's IMMBITS, no dash in that one, at mseminars.com. So you can send your ideas there. And sometimes it'll take a little bit of research to do. We might have to, it might not be my expertise. So in order for me to speak about it, I'm going to have to actually get some help. So that's something that may happen. But if you've got your burning immigration questions, please send them to one place or the other, and we will try to address them as quickly as we can, and get them up onto the get them up for you to watch. So that's all I have for today. You guys have yourself a great day, great couple of weeks, and we'll see you in 2. Talk to you soon. Take care.